Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Casey Baggett, one of the ministers here at Lost Tree Chapel, and I welcome you to this chapel talk this afternoon. It's not my role to introduce our two wonderful presenters, Reverend Dr. John Ross and Father Eric Hollas. They will be introducing themselves as they then introduce us to this wonderful St. John's Bible, a book of an extraordinary achievement of artistry and faithfulness, and we're very excited to be able to hear about it this afternoon, so we thank them for coming. And so my role is simply to welcome you, and I thought that it would be most appropriate to do that in Benedictine style, honoring the commitments of our presenters today. And let me tell you about the Benedictine style of welcome. When I was a mere seminarian 30-some years ago, I read the Rule of Benedict and was really taken with it and went to regularly then St. John's and St. Ben's monasteries and learned more about Benedictine spirituality. And the warmth of the welcome that I received there I have never forgotten. And it may be due to the fact that the Rule of Benedict, and I think it's chapter 53, I hope that's right, says that each visitor to the monastery should be welcomed as if he or she were Christ. And I felt the warmth of that welcome. And so I hope to our presenters and to all of you today here that you will experience that same welcome in our midst. We offer you respect, we offer you our full hearts, and we welcome you to this place for this experience. And so I'll turn this over to Dr. John Ross.
Well, good afternoon. So far, so good. We're used to saying good morning in this space, right? It's almost a little disorienting to say good afternoon, but Casey got it right. I got it right. Bob probably wouldn't get it right, would he? He'd go right with good morning. Well, by way of introduction, and by the way, I will tease Bob regularly, but never Casey, just to be clear. By way of introduction, my name is John Ross, and I have only two claims to fame that might make any sense to you, but really don't say much about me. The first is that I went to the same high school as Jack Nicklaus. I, like Jack, am a golden bear from Upper Arlington, Ohio. My second claim to fame is that I followed Bob Baggett as the senior minister at Wayzata Community Church in Wayzata, Minnesota, going on 20 years ago now. Now, I've since left that setting also, and I give thanks to God every day that I didn't have to follow Casey Baggett. Bob was a piece of cake to follow. Casey, no chance. I do believe that we tease the ones we love, and I love Bob and Casey Baggett. I know that you do too. You are so lucky and so blessed to have them here serving you at the Lost Tree Chapel. They are a real prize in the world. So thank you for this invitation, for the warm welcome that we have received here. I've already begun my introductions here. Again, my name is John Ross. And I am most famous as being Mr. Sheila Ross. After 30 years of ministry, I learned it was important to be a husband, a father, and a minister, and to keep it in that order. And when I did so, everything was just fine. But time did come for a change, and so when I left the local setting in Wayzata, I went on to serve St. John's University and Abbey in representing this remarkable collaboration of the human spirit and the Holy Spirit. I mentioned this Bible Dedication Sunday at Wayzata Community Church because I'm somewhere in that picture, a much younger version of myself. I mention it because it's important for people to know that I was blessed to have a 7-volume set of the Heritage Edition of the St. John's Bible in the local church setting where I served during my last 8 years there. So I have my own personal experience of the impact that this can have in a community, not just in a single organization, but in the broader community even beyond it. And I wanted you to know that. Here's what we're going to try to do this afternoon, and to do it rapidly, I'm going to give you a very quick overview of the original manuscript and the Heritage Edition. These are the two expressions of the St. John's Bible. Then Eric is really going to Father Eric's going to bring the primary content of the afternoon and invite us into an experience of this remarkable Bible. We'll save some times for Q&A, but you can interrupt us as we go along. We're going to keep this pretty casual. And then at the end, we're going to make sure to save time at the end so that you can come and turn some of the pages of this volume, which is Gospel and Acts, or the volume that's in the library, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. We want you to come and see and feel and touch. You'll learn here in the next 6 or 8 minutes that this exists for the purpose of being experienced, touched, and felt, and used in very real ways in the lives of real and faithful people. So as we begin, I want to share with you the mission of the St. John's Bible. The mission and the vision is 3 parts. First, to ignite the spiritual imagination of people around the world of all faith journeys. This has been the mission and vision from the very near start of this whole thing, and it remains to this day, to ignite the spiritual imagination of people around the world. And we've already managed to reach people all the way around the world, but there's plenty more to reach, and of all faith journeys. I have no doubt that the Lost Tree Chapel can appreciate not just the ecumenical nature of this project, but the interfaith and even the non-faithful who are moved by this experience of Scripture. And that was an early stated goal of the leaders, both at the university and the monastic community of St. John's, that this be a Bible for the world, for the whole world. So, as I said earlier, this is really the most important thing in my part, is that you understand there are 2 manifestations, there are 2 expressions of the St. John's Bible. There is first the original manuscript. This is the original manuscript that was commissioned by St. John's Abbey and University. They commissioned Donald Jackson, who was a world-renowned calligrapher then and still is today, to produce the first monumental, handwritten, hand-illuminated Bible, essentially since the invention of the printing press over 500 years ago. And this work unites that ancient Benedictine tradition with the technology and vision that we have today, the original manuscript. The Heritage Edition, about halfway through the project, they realized if they had only the one version of it, they wouldn't be able to fulfill their mission to ignite the spiritual imagination of people around the world. It'd be very, very difficult with just one version. So they commissioned Donald Jackson a second time to create the Heritage Edition, a fine art edition. Only 299 limited edition sets are being shared now around the world in their totality. 7 volumes, 7 books create the whole of the Bible. Now, very briefly, it's important to put this in a local context. It came out of Collegeville, Minnesota. St. John's Abbey and University is where all of the resources and all the effort and everything behind it began there, but they couldn't do it themselves, so they teamed up with Donald Jackson and a team of artists and calligraphers in Wales, in the United Kingdom. Principally, the original manuscript was created in a scriptorium in Wales, in the United Kingdom. So there was this transatlantic collaboration and cooperation from Wales to Minnesota that spanned more than 15 years. It started in 1981, though, when Donald Jackson, he's the one standing on the scaffolding there, came and visited St. John's as part of a calligraphy conference. It was a global gathering of calligraphers who were worried about what was happening to the art because of the computer font. And so they gathered together to talk about that and to learn from one another. And Donald Jackson met members of the monastic community at St. John's Abbey, not the least of which is sitting in the room today, Father Eric Hollas. This is Donald Jackson pictured at the very early stages of the project. But at the very end of it, Donald Jackson himself received a papal knighthood, a very rare and wonderful expression out of the Catholic tradition even though Donald is Anglican. It was in 1995, so we fast forward, we've been jumping around the time a little bit because I'm covering a lot in a super short amount of time, but Donald and Eric had lunch together one day. And that was the day Donald said, "Hey, Father Eric, how would you and the rest of the community up there like to commission me to write the whole Bible?" Now, it took a couple of years, but they said yes, and they eventually signed the commission in 1998. And it took a couple more years just to figure out how to do it. So it wasn't until the year 2000 that Donald Jackson actually put quill to vellum to begin, and they started with Gospels and Acts, and he started with the prologue to John's Gospel in the beginning. I'm going to play a very short video just to give you a little bit more sense of the experience that was behind the creation of the original. And so I'm going to play that now.
The scribe whom the monks chose was artist Donald Jackson, a professional calligrapher and illuminator who works with a team in his studio or scriptorium near Monmouth in Wales.
To explain what a calligrapher is in a Western context is very difficult, takes ages. But fortunately, now that I've been commissioned to write the Bible, it's very easy because I say, I'm writing the Bible. And the ultimate cliche pops into people's heads. Bald-headed old guy sits on a chair with a quill pen writing out the Bible for a group of monks. They say, oh yes, of course.
The project will take 7 years of Donald's life, and he and his team are about halfway through. The contract with St. John stipulated that 1,150 pages would have to be handwritten in the new Revised Standard Version of the Bible. It would be bound in 7 volumes. There would have to be 160 illuminations. The word illumination means the play of light on gold. The illuminator has a surprise ingredient which brings life and brilliance to the colors on the page.
I'm going to use egg yolk to mix with some of the colours. It's a technique that's been used for thousands of years. It's for 2 reasons. One, it binds the colour together, and the second is because it imparts a beautiful luminosity to the reds and warm colours that are used. And if you've ever tried washing egg yolk off the edge of your plate, you'll know how tough it is. Colour. Now see how it's starting to change immediately into a brilliant red. That looks the right consistency to start making capital letters. Here.
That just gives you a small sense of the approach and the scale and the time that it took to create this original manuscript, this masterpiece. Created on calfskin vellum, as it would have been in ancient times, with techniques that match those, with a very rare Chinese ink. There's amazing stories behind the ink that they used that we could do 3 hours on the ink all by itself, but we won't. The quills that they used, because if you're going to be writing something for the better part of 11 years, you want to have the lightest tool in your hands that is imaginable. But it's also keeping with the methods out of medieval times and earlier. There was a team of theologians and scholars that worked to choose the 160 passages that would be illuminated. And Eric's going to tell you more about what illumination really fully means. They worked along with artists from around the world, photoed here, and the scribes, of course, hard at work with all of the text copy, all of the actual words and letters. In the end, the original manuscript, 23 artists, 12 theologians and scholars, 15 years, created 160 original illuminations, original major pieces of art, 1,150 pages, 800,000 words, and 3.5 million letters. And along the way, they only made 9 mistakes. And Eric's going to tell you more about that later. 2011, they brought the final pages to campus there in Collegeville at St. John's, and the abbot and the president of the university signed it together, and amen. They created a beautiful gallery that's open to the public to this day. The remaining pages, which remain unbound, the original manuscript remains unbound. It's all on campus at St. John's right now. It all came home during COVID, and it hasn't left again since. Now, the Heritage Edition, a remarkable accomplishment in its own right. Donald Jackson was the artistic director of this project as well as the original manuscript. It's the only full-size fine art edition of the St. John's Bible. That goes without saying. Donald Jackson personally directed it. He moved to and lived in Minnesota for months at a time to oversee every page, every letter, every inch of this whole document, 1,150 pages or more, to make sure that it was true to the original. The paper is a remarkable accomplishment of science. The paper is designed and built to last for more than 1,000 years. The print that they used, the printer was unique at the time. There were only a few of these in the whole world. And now there's more, but this particular process of printing made a lot of things possible that wouldn't have otherwise been possible, not the least of which is to replicate what we call the show-through. On vellum, which is kind of transparent, you could see the show-through or the ink bleeding through the calfskin vellum. On 100% even uncoated cotton paper, you wouldn't see that same show-through, so they had to imitate it. As you see on the left side of the screen is the front page of the I am sayings illumination, and on the right side is the reverse side of that same page. And you can just kind of barely see the show-through, right? So here's a blow-up of the same thing. This is one side of the paper, and this is the other side. That show-through is actually printed on this side of the paper. And you'll see examples of that after the presentation when you page through some of the pages. No two heritage editions are identical because each did have some hand treatments done. The final step is the binding that happens out in Phoenix. So this thing has bounced around the world by the time it's all done. But the binding happens at a very unique place in Phoenix, Arizona. And well over half of the 299 heritage editions are now permanently housed in colleges, universities, churches and cathedrals, hospitals, clinics, libraries, museums, retreat centers, and in increasing number of private homes. Just some quick pictures of some of these locations where it's landed. I don't know who that handsome devil is in the bottom left corner, but it looks a lot like Father Eric Hollas. Creighton University, other places, the Basilica in St. Louis, St. Martin in the Field in London. They do some of the most remarkable creative things with the St. John's Bible there. This was part of a big concert with their choir and orchestra that sang Handel's Messiah. Meanwhile, huge projected digital images on the stained glass behind them. Mayo Clinic, not far from Minneapolis, up in Rochester, enjoys a heritage edition, and the Vatican, of course, has what we call the Apostles' Edition. I'm going to close and invite Eric up by telling you one very short quote. I heard this up on top of Mount Marcy in the Adirondacks 32 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. I heard and I forgot. I saw and I remembered, but I experienced and I understood. For me, in ministry and in my private life, the St. John's Bible is an experience of Scripture unlike any other that leads me to new understandings every time I open it, every single time. We hear things and we tend to forget them, right? Who can remember what the Scripture reading was on Sunday in church? Sorry, I shouldn't put you on the spot that way. Right? It's just true. We hear things, we forget them. We see them because we're very visual in our learning, but we'll often only remember it. But when we experience something, then we have a chance at new understandings. Eric's going to walk us through an experience of the St. John's Bible now. I told you I had 2 claims to fame at the beginning of our talk. Actually, I have 3. My third claim to fame is that I'm now a personal friend of Father Eric Hollas, because he's just one of the most terrific human beings I've ever met. Met him a long time ago in Phoenix, Arizona at a St. John's event, and now count it a great blessing to get to work with him and many other members of the monastic community. He is the current prior of St. John's Abbey in Collegeville. He's got degrees from Princeton and from Yale. He's a member of the faculty and the Department, School of Theology and the Department of Theology at St. John's University. He was, for about a decade, the executive director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and currently chaplain in the Western Association of the Order of Malta. Now, I'm going to invite Eric to come forward and to share with us some more about the St. John's Bible. Join me in welcoming him. It's all good? Good.
Yes, I need something. I need inspiration. So thank you very much for coming this afternoon, and I feel privileged to be here. It's actually not the first time that I've spoken in Palm Beach. A few years ago, we had an exhibit of original folios from the St. John's University at the Art Museum here in Palm Beach. So I spoke on that occasion. It was a lovely, lovely staging of the St. John's Bible as part of a longer tour of pages across the country. It's been a while since I've spoken about the St. John's Bible publicly like this. In fact, it's been, the last time I did something like this was before the pandemic, so I feel like I'm coming out of mothballs to do this. But I'm happy to be here. And I will say, both the pandemic for all of us and the St. John's Bible for me in particular has had a big impact on my life. Having worked on a project to handwrite the Bible was not lost on me, because one of my resolves during the pandemic was to stop using the computer to write letters and instead do them all by hand. And so I think since the pandemic started, in my log I have about 1,600 letters that I've written by hand and about 3 by computer. So it's been a kind of big impact on my life. And I appreciate the importance of the Word of God coming from the page of the Bible through your eyes, into your brain, through your muscles, and out your fingertips onto a page, because that was the experience of Donald Jackson. Someone asked him, well, how did this change you? Assuming that, it made him a saint or something like that. And he said, I can't tell you what it did to me spiritually, but I can tell you something that has happened that I reflect on regularly, and that is you can't help but be impacted by the Bible when it has flowed from the page through your mind, through your muscles, and out your fingertips. You've ingested and thought about and pondered and chewed on the Bible. You and the Bible become one. And that's the privilege of a calligrapher, to do this sort of thing. I met Donald Jackson many years ago, but the key moment for this project came when we had given a talk at the Newberry Library in Chicago. We had done a joint presentation on calligraphy, and afterwards, over lunch, he proposed to me what was his life's ambition, which was to make a handwritten, illuminated, monumental, meaning great big, Bible. And would St. John's be interested in that? And I distinctly remember at the time thinking, of course we would not be interested in this. No one does this anymore. No one's done this for 500 years. Were we to do it, we would likely find out why nobody has done this in 5 years. But I'm the kind of person who hates to say no. So I said, yes, I think we might be interested. So I chose my words carefully. I did not say we will be interested, we'll do it, let's do it tomorrow. We might be interested. So he took me at my word. So I went home to Minnesota and told no one about it for about 4 months. But being guilty, or feeling guilty about it, I thought, well, I've got to tell someone just to acquit myself of the promise to Donald Jackson. So I was driving to Minneapolis with the president of our school, Brother Dietrich, and being a good bureaucrat and knowing how to hide a bad idea, I buried it among about 12 suggestions that evening in the car. So I've made it number 7, figuring, well, he'll hear this and think, what a stupid idea, and we'll move on. So I broached the idea, and his immediate response after a moment of silence was, yes, we have to do that. And I was shocked because his lips said, yes, we have to do that. But his mind said, yes, you have to do that. And that's how I got stuck with this job. So it changed my life. Why in the world did we decide to do this? Well, first of all, we were looking at some way to celebrate 150 years since our start in Minnesota. Benedictine monks came originally from Germany to minister to the German immigrants in central Minnesota. And we were approaching 150 years and wanted to do something to commemorate that experience. There's lots of ways to celebrate anniversaries. You can build a building, make a statue, commission a painting, do something. But we decided to do something that was part of the monastic tradition for hundreds of years, and that was to create a monumental handwritten Bible using the materials of the Middle Ages, vellum, quilt pen, and so on. And it was a reflection then of the Benedictine tradition, which preserved the great works of antiquity in libraries that to some extent still exist today in Europe. We also wanted to do something that would spark the spiritual imagination in ways that other things could not. A building can inspire, but most of the architecture we look at is pretty utilitarian today. It doesn't inspire. But the Bible, presented in the context of 21st century art, could spark the spiritual imagination, and that was a goal. We also knew that the Bible was at the core of the Catholic theological and spiritual experience, though often Catholics tend not to think of that, and others have characterized Catholics as non-biblical. But in fact, it's at the core of our worship, at the core of our theology, at the core of our personal experience of God. So we wanted that experience, that point to make, that it's at the core of the Catholic experience, and certainly at the core of the Benedictine tradition. Our whole prayer life basically comes from the Bible. We also wanted to do something that was countercultural, and there's a lot that's countercultural about this. Think of the Heritage Edition, for example. The Bible itself, we anticipate that with a modest amount of care, it should be able to last 2,000 or 3,000 years. That is really countercultural today. We live in a throwaway society. Everything we make is designed to be thrown away in a few years, including even the buildings that we live in. I won't need to point out even houses of memory in this complex that are being replaced by others. I don't want to tiptoe into that issue, but it points up the fact that we live in a throwaway society. Houses, buildings are meant to last maybe 100 years max, and then we recycle it all. But then there is the more deep-seated commitment that Christians have, or at least we feel strongly in the Catholic tradition, that every generation has to express the sacred in art. It's why we commission composers to write new hymns. It's why we commission architects to design churches. It's why we commission artists to do paintings and sculptures and so on. Because every generation has a different experience of God. Just more recently, just imagine the Holocaust as an experience of God and how to relate to God in a time of deep challenge. You can't experience these things without having it impact your vision of God. And so every generation has the obligation to express artistically their experience of God. And in the Catholic tradition, for example, you can see hundreds of years of that tradition in the panorama of European churches and American churches as well. And so we felt the obligation to express the sacred in 21st century art and hoped that it would speak to people in some way. And then finally, there was the issue of just sheer curiosity. What would it be like to make something like this? And part of my job was to convince the monks that this was something they've been wanting to do for 20 years. Anyway, that was a chore. We had several meetings before they finally decided to do it. And the clincher was a story that I had read in the New York Times, yeah, I think it was the New York Times, of Temple Emmanuel in New York, in Manhattan, that had decided to make the construction of their new Torah scroll a public experience. And so people were allowed to come in and place their hand on the scribe's shoulder as he was writing the pages, inscribing the Hebrew lettering on the vellum. And his experience went something like this. Initially, he was just really kind of put off by the reaction of people. They put their hand on his shoulder, he wrote, they cried. He thought, what's wrong with these people? And then he realized what was happening. That through him, they were helping to make a Bible that had created them a people. And so I concluded in my presentation to the monks, if Jews can do this as part and parcel of synagogue experience today and for 3,000 years, Catholics ought to be able to do it once every 500 years and no one should get hurt. Curiosity should drive us, and in fact it did. So I'm going to look at a number of slides just to give you this kind of may seem out of order, but there's no way to present this as in order, because our experience with the St. John's Bible was not a linear experience. As Donald Jackson was working in Wales, we had people thinking and talking about it and viewing the images in Minnesota, and then eventually elsewhere. And so a lot of things were running concurrently. So some of this is going to show up in the kind of scattered comments I have to make this afternoon, but that's the way it went. I'm going to start with this image of a 17th century Torah scroll, or, whoops, no, I'm going to, there, good. This is a Torah scroll from a Syrian synagogue that was decommissioned quite some time ago, and it was given to us a few years ago, and it's at the entrance to our Bible exhibit gallery. And we like this for a lot of reasons, one of which is it shows the antecedents of the Christian Bible that we use today. But one important point, and that is in Jewish worship in a synagogue, you still have the Torah scroll as a scroll. It's an essential part of appreciating the Hebrew Bible. Christians early on decided that they wanted to distinguish the Christian scriptures from Jewish scriptures by introducing the codex, the bound book. So if you think of that as technology, because a book offers a way, to find a passage in a Torah scroll is a nightmare if you don't know where it all goes. To find a passage in the Christian Bible is much easier because it's paginated. In any case, the early Christians then wanted to distinguish the Christian Bible from the Jewish Torah scroll by having a codex. At the same time, they wanted to affirm the continuity between the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. And so the format ends up, the visual format looks very similar. Now in this Torah scroll, the difference is it reads from right to left. But what's important is if you look at the columns of text, it's their justified margins, it's neat, it's elegant, it's solemn, and just the visual format says, whatever this really is, it's important. Pay attention to what this is. Now, I hope you're not being distracted by reading the Hebrew text right now. But in any case, that's an important point. And this is how art and design influences our response to it. This is elegant and important. It's not a note. It's not a Post-it note on a refrigerator. And here you have a better sense of the pages. The justified margins, which suggest elegance. And this is how early Christian Bibles, once the Bible was gathered together, they looked like this. And so they would, some of the 4th and 5th century Bibles that we have left today have this same kind of format of these elegant columns of text. And the point is to make this, that the Christian scriptures depend upon and rely upon the Jewish scriptures that precede them. This is the beginning of the book of Genesis with the days of creation. And what's distinctive about the St. John's Bible is the reliance on art to communicate the meaning of the text. And I like to point out, from my perspective, that the role of the artist is not just to be creative from their own artistic design experience, but also artists are preachers. Art impacts the way we worship, the way we understand the sacred, the way we understand our lives. And so one of the byproducts of the St. John's Bible is a lesson I try to leave with people, and that is artists of all sorts, be they hymn writers, musicians, calligraphers, architects, teach us something. So you can look at this church, for example, this chapel, and something is being taught from the design of this chapel. For one thing, it is visually Presbyterian or Calvinist, and also with its sort of emphasis on the white monochrome organization. The design, the layout of the room says something about how this is used for worship. Very different from a Catholic church, and that's by design. But the artist, you can go home and read your church when you have the chance, because it will say something to you about your church, because every church is slightly different. In any case, that's the case with the attempt to portray the Bible in artistic terms. And so in this illumination, Donald Jackson shows the days of creation in strips representing the 7 days. You could portray the days of creation as a kind of cartoon strip with one block, the second block, the third block, like you do in the comics and the paper. Or you can just do it as a tableau. And doing it as a tableau allowed Donald Jackson to say something that's very important, and he could say it visually. Because as you go through look at the first strip, and you will see in what looks like chaos, which is the chaos at the beginning of creation, you have a gold line, and that's the point where God's creative hand enters into the process. So before it's kind of empty, with that gold line, you have the introduction of the presence of God increasing in creation, in the act of creation. So if you go forward, you will see those little squares of gold. As you go through each strip, the number of squares increases. And so this is a theological statement saying that God is present in creation. God is not absent, the world is not an evil place, and God is in the heavens. Rather, the work of God takes place on earth. This is a distinctively Christian as well as Jewish motif. Not all religious traditions see it that way. The ancient Greeks saw a dichotomy between the world and God and the gods who were in the heavens. We see God at work in our world, and it's what we inherit from the Jewish tradition as well. And so when you get to the 7th day, when God rests, you have a preponderance of gold, suggesting that this creation, this created order, is the product of God's divine handiwork. Now, through that, you see the various narratives, the light and the darkness, the water and the earth, and so on, the sun and the moon, the fish and the birds of the air, and then the creation of man and woman in the 6th column, and then the days of rest. And the Spirit hovers over the earth. The Spirit of God pervades the earth. And this is an important meditation on the message of the Bible. We believe that God hovers and works through us on the earth. So this is how you can appreciate how an artist can begin to give a sermon. Because the text doesn't really say all this explicitly, that God's there in every part of creation. It does obliquely, but the imagery allows you to conclude that. The gold in particular throughout the St. John's Bible represents the presence of God. And you pick that up especially when you turn the pages. When you turn these pages later on, you'll see the light hitting the gold, and it brightens. That's what the illumination is. Illumination is an English word coming from lux and lumen, a Latin word for light. And that light represents God. Then if you go to the next page, I have the two columns of text. And the point of this is to go back to what the Jewish format of the Bible looked like. So here, even before you read it, there's a certain elegance about that design. And so it says, whatever this is, it's important. Now, the other point Donald likes to make in his calligraphy is that calligraphy is much like music. Some calligraphy is elevator music. So if you look on the right column, you'll see what looks like elevator music, his version of elevator music. It's his standard script that he goes through the whole text. But then if you look at the right column, you have text that marks something special, and so he thinks of that as brass. The text on the right is strings, and so on down the line. We are heavily influenced by the design of script. If you do not believe this, go down to the grocery store and look at the products that you can buy and look at how you react to the package design. If it didn't matter, the packages would have just said soap, oats, wheat, beans, but no. There's something that suggests something distinctive about this product and why you should buy our beans instead of somebody else's beans, as just an example. So the end product of all this is that Donald thinks of this as music. I happened to walk through the Bible with someone, actually who's from Palm Beach, who had purchased a Heritage Edition, and he was on the board of the New York Opera, or the Met. Anyway, he was paging through and he said, "Oh my God, this looks like an opera score." Because Donald laid out each book, the pages on the wall of his studio, and then made sure that this was not a monochrome of text and design, and that you'd front load all the art on the first 2 or 3 pages. But rather he made sure that there was a kind of whoop and wharf, a dramatic point in the chapter, and then quiet times. And so in the course of each book of the Bible, he presents it as a kind of musical creation. And this particular person saw it as an opera score, which is exactly what Donald had in mind. So there's drama and there's quiet times. And the Bible, we have to remember, is not just kind of a monochrome tale. Unfortunately, the script in modern printed Bibles do not communicate the drama and the variation of emotion that's in the Bible. But in fact, the Bible has every human emotion. Hate, love, people get killed in the Bible. There's assault in the Bible. There is love in the Bible. There is giving birth to new life in the Bible, and so on. There's inspiration, joy, and sadness. And you can communicate that with the same typeface for 1,100 pages, but it's often why a lot of Bibles sit on refrigerators, because we don't perceive a drama from the design. But the St. John's Bible communicates, in the same way that medieval Bibles did, the drama that is in the Bible. One of the things that people ask about is, because this is done by hand, can you make mistakes? What do you do when you make a mistake? All of us have made mistakes when we've been writing. So what do you do? In the Middle Ages, there were lots of ways of dealing with this if you were a scribe, one of which is to scrape the mistake off with what's called your pen knife. Pen knife is called that because you use it to sharpen your quill pen. Your great-grandparents used a penknife to sharpen quills when they wrote letters. We don't do that anymore, but in any case, but you could also use that same knife to scrape ink off of vellum, which is wonderfully amenable to that. So you can scrape it off, and it appears as if it was never there. There's another way of dealing with that, and that is make turn adversity to advantage. So in this case, the scribe who was working on this particular page had left out a line accidentally and got to the bottom of the page because all this had to be laid out by computer to make room for the spaces that were needed for the illuminations. And you couldn't just kind of like cram as much on here as possible and save space and then put the illuminations wherever they just showed up. It was all laid out on computer, and so by the end of a page, you knew if you had left something out, because each line had specified words that went on it, and there were a certain number of lines, 32 lines per column. So if you got to the bottom and you still had space for 1 or 2 lines, you'd made a goof. So what Donald did in this case was to put the missing line in at the bottom. He drew a box around it, and then with these ropes and swirls, the lemur grabs the line in one hand, and with the other hand holds on to another rope that goes in the space where the line goes. Now, some people have said, Donald, that's a mistake. This is the Bible. It's the Word of God. You should tear this up and start over. And Donald said, no, we're not going to do that. And in the Middle Ages, they did this all the time. So you have these wonderful examples of whimsy in the Bible from medieval Bibles. But he said, we're going to do it this way because it's all there. All the text is there. It's maybe in unconventional presentation, but you can figure it out. You do not need a doctorate to figure that that's where that line goes, because it doesn't make sense without that line. But it also shows hints at the humor that shows up occasionally in the Bible. God has a sense of humor, and you know that because of your own life. So, he had a number of mistakes like this. Actually, his scribes did this. He had 6 or 7 scribes make mistakes, and he corrected them in this way. And then the happiest day in the experience of his scribal team was the day that Donald made a mistake. But he made a critically important mistake. This Bible was made in the order of importance for us. And he told us early on, if I get hit by a bus and my right hand can't work, what are you going to do? So what order do you want me to produce this? So we said, do Gospels first, Gospels and Acts, and then do Pentateuch and Psalms and so on. So Pentateuch came later in the process. But that's where Genesis is where his first mistake was made. It was on the first page of Genesis. So Donald made a mistake on the first page of the Bible. But to give people the impression that he knew what he was doing and he didn't want to call attention to it, he very discreetly wrote the missing words in a column, and you could hardly tell. So you'd look at that and say, oh, that's fine. But then these others brought attention to themselves. So he covered his tracks. And then you have something like this. This was just sheer exuberance. And in the Middle Ages, they did this sort of thing all the time, if they could afford to hire an illuminator. This was more expensive work than the text itself. Generally what happens is why a scribe could make a mistake like this is that if you take the line out, it often reads just fine anyway. With the line, it makes a big difference. So, for example, in one of the texts from the Pentateuch, the scribe left out a line that totally upended Jewish kosher law. Without the line, you could eat anything. With the line added back in, you couldn't eat things. So anyway, it makes a critical difference. But for a scribe just working line by line, if it reads okay, then you didn't leave anything out. But when they'd read the whole thing, then they realize, oh my gosh, I have goofed. But, just because we print things doesn't mean they're perfect. This is a text that I had looked for years. Some of you may know of it. It's the Wicked Bible. It's an edition of the King James Version printed in London in 1650. The best printers in the 17th century in terms of English were Dutch printers. Someone tried to save money by hiring a printer in London, and so when it came to the Ten Commandments, the printer accidentally left out one not, and if you got to choose, which not would you leave out? So anyway, let's see, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt commit adultery. So what wonderful news, all that in heaven too. Anyway, the printer got a heavy fine from the government, and he sold all his Bibles. So, but anyway, courtesy, I saw this finally at the Houston Baptist University, and they graciously allowed me to take a photo of it. But I just thought that was just really wonderful. It shows you what happens when you make a mistake. It's easier to correct calligraphy than it is to recall an entire edition of a printed book. This is an important text. This is the Ten Commandments. And I use this because of an experience I had at the Phoenix Art Museum when we had an exhibit, and I gave a gallery talk as part of their series. Because I'm a medievalist with a PhD in medieval studies, I could put on a medieval academic hat and give a talk as part of a museum series rather than put on a priest's hat. And so I had spoken about the Ten Commandments and my particular interpretation of this. And the important thing is when you see art, or even when you read the Bible, you're going to bring your own experience to that. And as a result, you are going to have your own vision of what that might mean, and it could be different from what your neighbor has. So this was the Ten Commandments. At the top, 1/3 of the folio, you have the language of God in gold leaf. Here I am, the God of your fathers, and so on. And then as you descend on the page, you begin to, he changes the lettering to black, bold lettering. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. And he deliberately uses this bold black lettering to give it a sense that this is it. What you see is what you get. These are not 10 recommendations, 10 guidelines, 10 suggestions, and if you can't do them, okay, you do the best you can. You know, if you're going to kill people, okay, but you know, feel bad about it later. No, these are non-negotiables for God. And then you go down further on the page, and the point I make is that if you can, this is the human response to the law of God, and if you cannot align your human aspirations with God's will for you, your life descends into chaos. And by the bottom of the page, you've got chaos, and that's where you are when you are far from the Word of God. So after my talk, a young woman came up and said, you know, I understand what you're saying, but here's what I see. This is the story of human life and growth. Everyone starts at the bottom of the page making nice, cute, gurgling noises as 1-week-old infants. And by the 2s and 3s, we start to form syllables, and then we begin further up the page, we start to make words. And then the words become kind of ominous with that dark black. And then from the top are the not just the demands of God, but the demands of our parents. And so we're running up against conflict with our parents, between ourselves and our hopes and what our parents wish for us. And then at a certain point, they start to blend, and gradually our aspirations switch, and so that the aspirations of our parents for us start to become our aspirations for ourselves. In other words, we become our parents after a while, you know, horror of horrors. We become our parents and absorb their values, and they become embedded within us. And gradually we move towards the holiness that the top of the page suggests. So this is the story of human existence, from birth to holiness and union with God. And after I thought about it, I told her, well, you know, that's better than what I had to say. So, but the point is this. You're going to bring some of your own ideas and your own experiences to the reading of the Bible, and an artist is going to present possibilities that are going to evoke these responses in you. So be grateful for what artists do for you and for all of us. One of the things that medieval scribes and illuminators did was to put the local flora and fauna within their texts. So you can often tell where a Bible or a book came from because of the illustrations. So if it was made in Germany, you'd have the plants, the flora and fauna of Germany or France or England or whatever. So what Donald did was to hire a botanical artist who spent a summer with us at St. John's sketching the animals and the plants of central Minnesota. And so like other Bibles, it can betray where it comes from by the flora and fauna. So this is, if not just Minnesota, it's the Midwest of the United States or upper Midwest of the North American continent. That's important. Here's another error, but this allows you to kind of draw a spiritual interpretation from the text that you might have missed, or at least this is his interpretation. The sower sows the seed. The sower, in this case, the sower sows the word. And that, it doesn't say that specifically that is Jesus, the text, but we assume it's Jesus, but Donald chose to clothe Jesus in modern jeans as a way of saying, we are the sower too. But what's significant is those brown spots. That's the seed that he's throwing into the text. And so the seed becomes the Word of God. And that Word goes from the page to our eyes and into our minds. And that's how we absorb it. And that's how God sows his seed in you, by reading the Bible, by listening to it read in church, by hearing sermons preached on it. But your own reflection of the Bible is a way in which you absorb the seed of God. But what's significant here is, as he throws it into the text, what is the seed? There's another aspect to being the seed of God. And in this case, the text where the seed is being thrown is the calling of the disciples. So when someone stands in this pulpit and reads the Word of God to you, you are receiving the seed, but you become the seed of God in this world, and you make alive the presence of God in the world. So that becomes a sermon that you would not necessarily get by just reading the text all by itself, literally. This is a particularly dynamic page. This has a number of parables, but the parable I want to draw your attention to is the one that runs from the lower left corner of the text diagonally up the page to where it ends at the far right. And it's the parable of the prodigal son. And so you have in the center of that strip the father welcoming his son who has just left the pigs behind, and you see a gold ring and the multicolored cloak that he gives to his son for welcoming him back. The son who was dead is now restored to life, and father and son are together again. Now, if you go up the side of that, you'll see two cylinders, and they have a particular significance, two bits of significance. For one, our committee that worked with Donald on this text said, you were working on this when the World Trade Center disaster happened. So therefore, this is a dating of this text. 500 years from now, somebody will look at this and say, well, it's probably done in North America or shortly after the time of the World Trade Center disaster. And Donald said, that's correct. It is a date for when this was made, but it's not why I did it there. I did it there because there are all kinds of ways to respond to the World Trade Center terrorism. You can go and take revenge and get even and blow up the people who did it. You can bomb their country or town. You can do all kinds of things, put an embargo on. But if you are ever going to free yourself from the grip of an evil deed done to you, you have to forgive and forget and leave it all behind and get on with your life, just as the Father does with the prodigal son. And that got me to thinking, because there is no passage in the Bible that says the next day after the Father has welcomed his prodigal son back, he reminds him that, hey, remember, I forgave you these horrible things. Just don't ever forget. And then make the son's life miserable because the Father doesn't really forgive. He just doesn't want anybody to forget. But rather, the Father is the one who comes out way ahead in this deal, because he has forgiven his son and he gets to go on with life. He's done what he can, and he's not going to let the evil of his son rule his life and distort it. So that's a great lesson for us all. Evil happens to us all, but if we let it occupy our mental living rooms for the rest of our lives, we need psychological help just to get through this, or the help of a friend. So it's important that when evil is done to us, we learn how to forgive and move on, so that we are free of evil, so that we can make room for God in our lives. So that becomes a way of using visually an image to preach a sermon that's important for each one of us to learn. And here you see the close-up of the Father welcoming his son. This one I love. This is from the book of Wisdom. It's the Wisdom Woman. And I love this because this is perhaps the most countercultural image in the St. John's Bible. It says at the passage he's illuminating is this: for she is a reflection of eternal light. She is the image of beauty. And Donald does this in gold leaf and platinum leaf. And it's countercultural in this way. In our culture, we tend to think of the 19-year-old gymnast as the quintessential beautiful person. We use that kind of an image to sell stuff, cars, clothes, all sorts of things. You cannot imagine someone as old as 50 being used to sell stuff, because we think of someone who's a real ancient relic at the age of 35 as like yesterday's news. Our society treasures the young image, the young, vital, beautiful person. But this image says that beauty comes from experience. In this case, the lines on her face are the result of her lifetime of service to her family, her friends, giving hospitality to those in need. And this is what makes a person beautiful: service to one another and love for one another, not the veneer of physical beauty. So in this respect, this is a very countercultural statement in our culture. And it's a reminder that people at any age in their life are capable of being beautiful. And sometimes someone of age 90 has an advantage in beauty over someone aged 19. So, and because this is the mirror of eternal life, when you look at this page, you should see yourself. And so Donald actually puts a square in there, which you cannot see right now, but if you look at it from a right angle, your face will show up in that image. And it's a reminder that you are beautiful, because God has created you beautiful, whatever age you've accomplished at this point in your life. I'm going to close with this particular passage, or this illumination, and it shows you how text can reflect or can convey emotion. So in this respect, if you look at the top, this is from 1 Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind, and so on. And I can barely read it from here. In the tongues of mortals, if I don't have love, I'm a noisy gong. And so that's the ominous text in the upper right. And then you get to this wonderful harmonious text of the left column: love is patient, love is kind, and so on down the line. And so the whole tone shifts to something quite positive. And that's what calligraphy can do. Calligraphy expresses something that you can't do with just monochrome, single black text, 11-point times Roman. 1,100 pages of that will put you to sleep, which a lecture late in the afternoon can also do. But that's, I think, the most important point that I would leave with you today. Text says something about, art says something that expresses our appreciation of life, and in the case of the Bible, expresses something of our understanding and experience of God. So I always conclude with the comment that all of us should be attentive to the artists in our midst. Artists see life differently from the rest of us, and sometimes they see it weirdly and sometimes they see it beautifully. But the important thing is we have to appreciate what they do and give them their due. Artists see things that we don't see. It's why we go to museums and are inspired by the art that we love. It's why we buy copies of the art we love, and so on down the line. So I always encourage my own students, for example, it's nice to listen to music from your computer, but it's nicer to go listen to live music because that's real. And you're watching somebody making mistakes, a little bit of errors in their music performance, but nevertheless, that's real. Music from our computer is perfect because we edit out all the mistakes. It's perfect. But experience art and music and everything else from the source and appreciate that they see life differently from the rest of us. And that's what Donald Jackson has done with the St. John's Bible, and that's what artists have done with biblical texts and other texts through the centuries. We owe them a great deal because they preach as a preacher does in a pulpit. And for that, we owe them our great thanks. Thank you. So I think John and I are going to entertain questions for a while, and then we're going to allow you to come up here or into the library to see 2 volumes from the Heritage Edition.
Handheld mic here, and I would appreciate if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and let me get the microphone to you before you speak your question. Is there anybody that has something?
First of all, thank you. This is an extraordinary gift that you're giving us, and my question is going to be so small and mundane, but the columns, you say, are justified, the margins are justified. How does that happen? Do they just end the word there and start the new one, even if it's not the break in the word?
Actually, that's a wonderful question because that was a huge concern for lots of reasons, artistic and technical. They had to lay the whole thing out on a computer. And so, because what they did, we had 160 illuminations. They had to reserve spaces for the illuminations. And so they reserved the spaces first, and then, because it was on computer, they could make constant adjustments. But to do the justified margins, a designer had to come and specify the words that go on each line. So a scribe could not violate that. But the nice thing about it is a computer can put the words that are going to fit in that space, but they can't do it artistically. They have no artistic sense. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, here's how they laid it out. And so, but it's the scribe who has to fit those words elegantly in that line. And so they can stretch them or compress them to make it fit. And then that allows them to justify the margins. This is a sidebar, but I'll tell the story of Donald when he wrote a charter for the Queen, and he got to the end and discovered he'd made 3 mistakes. And he thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And so he scraped them off, because it was on vellum, he could do that, and then put in the words. But the words that were supposed to go were shorter than what he had done. So what he did was just make them bigger to fill in. So the Queen came in to sign the thing, and she was about to sign it, and she turned to him and said, Mr. Jackson, I noticed that in this spot, and this spot, the text is larger. Why is that? And he said, well, ma'am, this is a very long and boring document with lots of words, and so you vary the text to interest the reader. So that's how that worked. But so they had to design the whole thing and lay it out. And they also had to make sure that the lines on one side matched the lines on the other, because the text will show through from the other side. So if you shift the lines down a half a line on the back side of the vellum, it's all going to show through as black shadows, and you just have a column of black. So they did in the Middle Ages too. It had to be done this way. So the justified margins had to be planned out. And a scribe who tried to save, there was no percentage in a scribe trying to save future page space by cramming more words onto a line, because it would throw everything off, including an illumination of a particular text. But because some enterprising scribe saved space, the illumination was 2 pages away from the text. So your question is not incidental. It was a key big thing from the beginning.
Are there other questions?
Yes, I'm curious. Are there going to be copies that are going to be made of this Bible, St. John's Bible?
Yeah, this is a copy right here, right in front of you. Yeah. There are 299 sets of these, what are called the Heritage Edition.
Do you have an objective of more than 199?
299, no, because we threw away the proofs.
So that will be it?
That will be it, yeah.
Wow.
So maybe that was foolish, but we wanted to make it a limited edition, so you have to put limits. So actually, we discussed for 2 years what limited would be. How many is limited? We decided limited was less than 300, so 299. Yeah.
Father Eric, share with us how this was shared with other religions.
Well, for one thing, scattered throughout our experiences of other religious traditions. Obviously, Judaism figures prominently in this, and so there. I didn't have time to spend on some of this, but the genealogy of Jesus with the menorah was one way of showing Christianity's debt and dependence and continuity with the Jewish tradition. So the menorah was a reminder. Donald used it as the family tree, but he did all the genealogy of Jesus in both Hebrew and English, except for one name. And at the root of that tree is Abraham in English and Hebrew, and Sarah in English and Hebrew, and Hagar in English and Hebrew and Arabic, which is a reminder that we may or may not like this, but the Muslims are part of this religious orientation. And so that was just but one example. And then the mandala that appears on that page, a symbol of eternity from the East. He uses those. There are references to southwestern U.S. art from Navajo and others, and so on down the line. So strictly from an artistic point of view, Donald borrows from other traditions and incorporates them because, and there's one particular illumination where he does this quite deliberately and visually, and that's in the Psalms. Because there's one section where he has, actually through the Psalms, there is a computer digital print of the monks of St. John's singing chant, and he does that in gold leaf across the length of the Psalms. But every now and again, vertically, he will have digital printouts of a Jewish men's choir singing the Psalms, and Muslim chant, and Sufi chant, a Tibetan prayer bell, and so on down the line. and they run vertically, and they intersect periodically. And the reason why he does this is because he says that there are lots of ways of approaching God, but in our voices, in our song, we eventually have the possibility of converging in our approach to God. And so having them crisscross becomes an optimistic statement about all of us seeking God through song, through sacred song, because there's something in the human spirit and deep within each of us that wants to sing and sing in a sacred mode, if that makes sense. So that was a very explicit reference to out of our differences in sacred song, we all approach God.
And Father Eric, would you then also speak about the reception of this wonderful Bible among different traditions?
John is probably better suited to that, but obviously we've presented some of these to copies or sets to like the Vatican, but there's a set at St. Martin in the Fields in London, so if you have an opportunity to visit that church, you'll see it on display there. This fall, we have a major presentation at, do you want to say that or shall I?
Oh, go ahead.
We have a major presentation of Heritage Edition sets to Canterbury Cathedral, Durham Cathedral, Salisbury Cathedral, and then an Apostles Edition to Lambeth Palace, which is the medieval residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then an Apostles Edition sometime in the next few months to the National National Cathedral in Washington, which are all a bit Anglican, but other churches as well.
Well, one of the most explicit experiences of a multi-faith happened in Omaha, Nebraska. There's a church there called the Tri-Faith Initiative. It's a Christian church that's part of the United Church of Christ, an Islamic center. It's not a mosque, but it's a center, and they have an imam that's present there, and a Jewish synagogue. They share one piece of property together. They built 3 different worship spaces, but they share parking lots because they don't worship at the same time. So there's this sort of economic model going on, but it's really a statement in the world about how these faith traditions intersect and how they can lean on one another and learn from one another. And I was there preaching this past year on Easter Sunday, and it was the first time in like 15 years that Passover and the Christian Holy Week and Ramadan were all in the same 3-day period. It was remarkable. And to have the St. John's Bible there and being passed around all 3 of these faith communities was remarkable. It was really breathtaking.
I have one other example that just comes to mind, and that was something that my mother never told me I would do. Having grown up in Oklahoma City, it was a different part of the country with different religious traditions, but on a Monday, I gave a talk at one university which had acquired a Heritage Edition and built a gallery for it. And on the following Saturday, I gave a talk at another university that had acquired a Heritage Edition for its collection. On Monday, I spoke at Carson Newman University in Jefferson City, Tennessee, and spoke from the pulpit of the First Baptist Church in Jefferson City, Tennessee. That was an awe-inspiring experience, totally unexpected on my part, but they had bought a Heritage Edition. And then on the following Saturday, I spoke to the annual meeting of the Friends of the Rare Book Library at Brigham Young University. So on Monday, I spoke to Baptists. On Saturday, I spoke to Mormons. And if that's not interfaith, I don't know what is. But I found it personally inspiring to be able to do that. But it shows the ability of a project like this to speak beyond just a kind of sectarian approach. Yeah.
How did you receive the funding for this, and how much funding was required? This was a 3-year plus.
Oh, this was a multi-year project. And that's a very good question. We knew we couldn't spend tuition money on it because the students would complain, so we wouldn't do that. What we decided to do was to invite people to contribute to sponsor a verse or an illumination, quarter-page illumination, half-page illumination, full-page illumination, a book of the Bible, a volume, because there's 7 volumes. So there were various ways of sponsorship. And so that's basically how we paid for it, through the generosity of people who kind of did their part. I think in part we borrowed from other traditions, religious traditions in doing this. So it allowed all kinds of people to participate. And then secondly, it cost, originally we thought this was going to cost $3.5 million. And of course, when you double the time, the costs go up. So it ended up costing about $7 million, which can sound like a lot of money, but that's roughly, in economic terms, what it cost to do it in the Middle Ages. So it wasn't out of line. But then secondly, it was a major statement in this regard. In the United States, anyway, in our culture, if you want to say something's important, you got to put money behind it. If this cost us $1.98, no one would pay attention to it. But because it cost a bunch of money, everyone said, oh, wow, why'd you do that? How could you do that? And I always justify this because just strictly in terms of amortization. In Minneapolis, we paid $68 million to build a football stadium that we tore down after 25 years. So if you amortize that, anyway, then we made this Bible that's expected to last 3,000 years. So if you amortize the cost of our Bible over 3,000 years and that stadium over 25 years, I think we came out way ahead. So. But cost aside, it was an opportunity to invite a lot of people to be part of this. And people found it inspiring to come and see what they helped make happen. And then we made a full-size, an 8th volume to match the size of the others, done on vellum with all their names. And illuminations for those who made bigger contributions. And that'll last 2,000 or 3,000 years too. So there's very few ways to achieve kind of recognition that lasts a long time in this earth, but this was one of them.
We want to be respectful of our presenters' time and your own and give you an opportunity to be up close with this incredible work of art. So with your permission,
yeah.
Are we ready to move to that?
So let me just explain. This is the Gospel and Acts volume here, and Father Eric will stay here and host anybody that wants to come up and just stand right around this. In the library is the Pentateuch, so it's the first 5 books. So if you want to see that creation illumination or some of the other mistakes, you can go into there, and I'll be in there to host you and there. And I just want to say thank you again. This project has been a grand collaboration, right?
Yeah.
It's been a grand collaboration from the start, and that tradition continues now at the Lost Tree Chapel. So thank you.
Thank you.
Coming.
Great job.
Was that okay?